Thanks to everyone who's watching. I'll be talking a little bit about this recent precedents in Brazil that have authorized animals to act as plaintiffs in lawsuits, which is something quite important, I think, in terms of animal law. And I would like to analyze that case based on ethics of care and eco-phenomenology. I'm part of this research group at my university that's coordinated by my PhD advisor, Professor Ana Paula Barbosa Forman. And we deal with interdisciplinary matters, so phenomenology for one, also disabilities, human rights as a whole, non-human animals, and ethics of care. So we always take this, literature as well. So we always take this interdisciplinary approach to different topics. But because of the time, I'll try to make the first part faster for us to maybe stay longer on the arguments that led to the decision that I'll be, actually the petition I'll be analyzing here about animals acting as plaintiffs. Okay, so a word about eco-phenomenology, because I do not know how many of you are familiar with this idea. The expression eco-phenomenology, the eco plus phenomenology, is quite recent, but it's just to say that we're not talking about phenomenology as a whole, which of course is quite the wide field, but we're talking specifically about phenomenology that's concerned about our relations with nature and with non-human animals. Of course, I will not be dealing with phenomenology here as a whole, but in particular with this idea of intentionality, which is a word very commonly associated with phenomenology. And specifically here, because I'm dealing with non-human animals, I'll be talking about intentional consciousness of non-human animals, or to echo Christine Korsgaard, the idea of creatures, that we are animals and non-human animals, all creatures, so we all have this intentional consciousness. So this is a concept that can be used to deal with those hard cases when we're dealing with humans as well. So the idea of phenomenology when it's talking about this intentional consciousness is that we are not anymore in this universe where the self or consciousness is closed inside the mind, completely apart from the outside world. There's in fact a bridge between the inside and the outside world that it means that consciousness, even at first, at the beginning, it's always consciousness of something, an experience of something. This is what Husserl established. So we have a bridge between the inside and the outside world that allows us to see what one might be experiencing, what one might be thinking, and we can actually look inside these worldviews of different subjects, be they human or not. So this is a very important landmark to talk about animals as beings who have this intentional consciousness. Intentionality here also, it's important to mention, it's not the usual sense of intentionality. So for instance, oh, today I intended to wake up early, but I was not able to. So that's not the idea. It means exactly that connection of your actions, your consciousness being always connected to something outside. So if I think about, I think about something. I think of a tree, or if I see a car. If I remember a certain situation. So it's always this connection. And this is something that I've been researching with my advisor, professor advisor, to determine that animals do possess this kind of consciousness, this intentional consciousness that makes them subjects, intentional subjects that have agency in their day-to-day life, and that make decisions, that have a kind of autonomy, and in the sense that they well, of course, phenomenology is very concerned with the body. So through their senses, they experience the outside world, and then they make their decisions. They determine whether a certain a certain thing that happened with them is important or not, and how they should react to that. And it's not something that it's always going to be the same way, like mechanic. It's going to be something that it's going to vary from subject to subject. I've been doing that research mainly with Merleau-Ponty, who has been influenced a lot by Uexküll, who did his research at the end of the 19th century, first half of the 20th century. And he worked with biologists. He is considered by many one of the first persons who were concerned about animal behavior. And he has a very interesting concept for me, that's very original, because he talks about the Umwelt. And of course, it's not the, oh, I'm sorry, you can't see the slides, I think, because of, let me, yeah. Okay, so the Umwelt is not just environment, but is this idea that each animal subject construct their own worlds through their senses. So each animal is going to have their own real world. There's not an universal real world that goes for everyone. Each animal is going to produce their own worlds through their different senses. And he uses a metaphor of the soap bubble to demonstrate how you have many Umwelten co-living and how they also relate to one another, how they communicate to one another, and how different things, for instance, a flower can mean food for a certain subject, can mean a pathway for another, can mean something like a decor, or so it depends on the Umwelt. And so he talks about this autonomy in animals. He's trying to get away from the Cartesian view of animals that were seen as machines, and he's trying to establish that biology should not be following those exact science's rules. And so he's talking about this very literal autonomy of how even, for instance, an amoeba can choose to move in one direction rather than another. So even this amoeba anticipates its surroundings by interpreting cues and signals as significant, suggesting a kind of intentionality towards its Umwelt. I know it's a little bit abstract, hopefully, maybe not, but I brought some images. So this, of course, here you have this little, I don't know if it's who it is exactly, with the bubble and the Umwelt of that butterfly. This painting to the right is a painting by my grandfather, actually, and it's of a beach in São Paulo. And this is what, when we think about a beach, what we envision, like the ocean, and maybe some here we have some banana trees, a fisherman's house, some rocks. But then if you think about the sea, you can have multiple Umwelten there, where all of this that we are seeing doesn't make any sense. It doesn't even exist. So we have, of course, it's more clear when we think about the bat, because, you know, a bat has different senses than we do, and we can always use Nagel's example of, is it possible to think like a bat? But the idea is that perhaps, yeah, maybe not exactly, but there's a way for us to access that. So the idea here is to understand a little bit about this different Umwelten. So to make it more clear, the animal, when we are dealing with Uexküll, can be read as an intentional subject because they operate their bodies, their organs, and their sensations, and they leave marks on their Umwelten. So they feel, they perceive, and through their sensations, they are able to establish a connection with this environment and with other animals. And this is everything, all of these movements that animals make are intentional movements that, according to phenomenology, present a certain animal as an intentional subject. So this is the first thesis here that I wanted to bring to you. I know we'll be talking a little bit later, so I will not ask if you have doubts about it yet. So a word about ecofeminism now. I know it sounds like two different, completely different topics, but I do believe they connect. So ecofeminism, of course, comes from the critical studies field. And we have this connection of feminism, which of course is a political, much older movement, and everything that's equal. And I'm using here the idea of intersection by Kimberly Crenshaw. Of course, it's not overlapping violences, but rather connecting different violences. So you could think about race and gender, for instance, and seeing how they interconnect, where they interconnect. And the methodology, of course, would be to study those violences through this interconnection. And this is what we're doing with not just feminism. Here we have, of course, gender debates in general, and everything that's maybe related to nature or to animals. And it's a political philosophical movement that is trying to connect, so the violences and how we diminish women and nature, and how that relates to one another. But I will not get into that with detail, because what I'm interested in is ethics of care. So the expression was created by Françoise de Beaune in 1974, although Marty Kill suggests that it appeared independently in other places around the same time, so perhaps a little bit organically. And so it's not something that's very old. It's a relatively new movement, and it has many branches. So you have all sorts of ecofeminisms, and it's a very problematic or maybe controversial concept, because we have, for instance, branches who treat women in an essential manner. So women are naturally more caring, more nurturing, and nature is feminine, so Pachamama. And so do we want to do that? Do we want to say that women are naturally less rational or naturally? I don't think so. So we have, of course, and this is what I prefer, that ecofeminism that's more constructivist, and that will employ, for instance, Simone de Beauvoir, who was the first philosopher to treat women as others, and to say that, as you all know, we are not born women, we become women. So this is what we're dealing here with, this idea that care is not something that is essentially feminine, but because of our cultural and historical developments here in Western societies, has become associated with women. And we also have branches of ecofeminism that are very related to spiritualism and religion. And this is something I don't follow either. So I like Alicia Puleo, for instance, who is an Argentinian. Actually, she's a professor now. She teaches in Spain. And she doesn't do that thing that's very complicated about post-humanism, that is to refuse everything that came out of Enlightenment. So she likes the idea of equality or of autonomy, because that's what allowed women to get their civil rights in the first place. So she just wants to perhaps take ethics of care and employ it, of course, to the ethical framework, not refusing other forms of ethical thinking. Another debate that is important, I think, is the debate between animal ecofeminism and nature rights. And that's particularly important in Latin America, because we have, for instance, the Constitution of Ecuador, that gives rights to nature, but it does not give rights specifically to animals. So it's that idea that we talked about in the workshop, that animals are part of fauna, are part of the environment. They are just part of something. They don't matter in themselves. So we have, for instance, Vandana Shiva or other ecofeminists that are concerned with the relation between gender and nature. And what I find more interesting is that ecofeminism of Josephine Donovan, Carol J. Adams, Catherine McKinnon, Alicia Puleo, Marty Kiel, who are actually dealing with that figure of the animal. And I'm sure you're familiar with the feminist critique to traditional animal rights, which is that They are usually very rational. It's a debate that's always intends to be very universal and leaves aside factors such as empathy and emotions. And I guess the classical example they give is when you start reading Animal Liberation, the first thing Peter Singer says is, I don't have pets or companion animals. I don't have any particular care for animals, but it is not right to mistreat animals, so we should not do it. Even if you don't like children, for instance, you should not go about kicking children in the streets, right? So that makes sense, of course. I think that makes sense. But I became a vegan, for instance, reading Animal Liberation, and maybe of course his argument is very good, although I'm not an utilitarian, but it's a very good argument. But what got to me really were the many reports on how animals suffered. So I stopped using I started using cruelty-free products after the first chapter, then I stopped eating meat and then dairy, and I followed that order, like literally. So does an empathy play an important role in animal liberation? So that's what the feminists are saying. This is an example that I brought to maybe debate this. Of course, you've probably all read Lives of Animals or Elizabeth Costello by Coetzee. And there's this certain part where Elizabeth Costello, his character, this professor, is giving a lecture about how animals are being explored. And she makes this very problematic analogy to the German Holocaust. And this is something that is a reason why, I guess, organizations such as PETA get so criticized, because they compare so much like women liberation or slavery and German Holocaust with what's going on with animals. And that's, of course, problematic, especially for people who have gone through that sort of violence and who still go through that sort of violence, because it's something that's present, and who have been animalized in the past and are maybe could feel that they are being animalized right now. But I don't think what she's doing here is comparing these two events. So here's what I highlighted. So she's talking about Treblinka and how people who lived around the camp, in a general way, they might have guessed what was going on. They did not know for sure, said that, while in a sense, they might have known. In another sense, they did not know, could not afford to know for their own sake. Willed ignorance on their part. Ignorance may have been a useful survival mechanism, but that is an excuse which we refuse to accept. And then moving on a few paragraphs, I was taken on a drive around Waltham, the city where she was, this morning. It seems a pleasant enough town. I saw no horrors, no drug testing laboratories, no factory farms, no abattoirs, yet I'm sure they are there. They must be. They simply do not advertise themselves. They are all around us as I speak, only we do not, in a certain sense, know about them. So I think what she's doing is she comparing how we are able to close our eyes to these violences and turn off our empathies towards nature and towards non-human animals. It's what Derrida said in The Animal, Therefore I Am. He calls it a true genocide, what we do to animals. And he wonders, how are we able to keep that from ourselves? We go to bed at night and we are able to just forget what we do. And I remember once I was traveling in São Paulo by car, and I saw this truck filled with pigs, and they were piled one on top of the other in very small cages, and they were so small that I could see their fat coming out, their small pigtails, and I thought, oh my God, I have to stop eating pig. That same weekend, I went to have a burger, and I had fries with cheddar and bacon. And how was I able to do that? So that's what's in question, I think. This is what Hannah Arendt, of course, is in Eichmann in Jerusalem, maybe wondering as well, like it's not about what Hitler did, but that banality of evil, neighbors telling on neighbors, or maybe turning a blind eye, and what Donna Haraway asks, are we all Eichmann? And if we are, how can we change that? So this is a little bit about what I think feminists are trying to wonder, how can we bring that into the ethical debate? So to make this again less abstract, I brought this just as an example, Ethics of Care by Marty Kuhl. She brings 4 elements that she considers crucial for an ecofeminist ethics of care. So first, preventing the abuse of nature by removing these conceptual blocks that prevent us from development of empathy towards the natural world. So of course, we could think about Melanie Joyce Carnism here as an ideology that prevents us from actually feeling that empathy towards animals, or about Carol J. Adams and so forth. Then she proposes a contextual approach that situates ethical dilemmas in their social, psychological, and historical context. So again, we're not talking about universal concepts, and we're looking at reality. And feminists have this different methodology of dealing with empirical studies and hard cases, no concrete cases, and so forth. She also focuses on acts of care. She says that part of the task of giving animals patient loving consideration is perceiving them as individual beings with emotion, needs, and desires. And finally, she works with the vegan practice. And this has to do with the emphasis given by feminists that the personal is political. So the actions we take on a daily basis in our lives have social and political impacts. And let's bring everything together before we move on to analyzing animals as plaintiffs in Brazil. We have the standpoint theory of Josephine Donovan, who is of course an ecofeminist. And in her standpoint theory, what she's doing is she's saying that, contemporary theories of animal ethics, they fail to respond and incorporate the expressed viewpoint of animals in their analysis. So they are there making decisions of, is this right, is this wrong, with animals as object of those decisions. And then we had Lukács with Marxist theory, standpoint theory with the proletariat, saying that, okay, so if you want to see how to treat the proletariat, maybe we should not be asking the employer, but we should be asking them how they have been treated, how they are feeling, and what they want. Feminists borrowed that and used it in ethics of care. And then Donovan brought that to deal with animals. So what she argues is that humans must listen to what animals are telling us and formulate our ethical responses accordingly. So she mentions Darwin and Uexküll, who I just mentioned, and other cognitive ethologists who have established that through caring and sympathetic attention and interspecies dialogue, animal communications can be understood. So the idea is that we have a duty to listen to these communications and to act responsively. So the reason why we should not harm, kill, eat, torture, and exploit animals is because they don't want to be treated that way. And so we have what Eva Meyer calls this political communication, which is when animals escape or they reveal with their intentions, their intentional movements, that they do not wish, for instance, to be kept in captivity. So we have animals fleeing zoos, we have animals trying to escape slaughterhouses, and so forth. But Eva Meyer goes further, and she says that animals have languages. So she brings many different examples of how different animals have very complex languages that through technology we're now able to perhaps translate. So they have, for instance, she talks about prairie dogs who have grammar, they have verbs and nouns and adjectives, and dolphins, bats, and parrots who name their children. And she says that bats gossip a lot because they're always chatting, and whenever one of them, because they always have the same name for all their lives, one of them leaves the premises, the others keep talking, mentioning his name a lot. So we have been able to realize that animals do have a very complex language, and what she wonders is what does that mean in terms of political communities and so forth. So this is a little bit what concerns me, traditional ethical animal ethics or debates in general, they don't usually take the viewpoint of the animal under consideration, and they don't usually turn to the umwelt of that animal and to the perspective of that animal, protecting them as part of something, or looking at them as something that's part of fauna, or as something that's an object, and does not consider them as subjects who have intentionality and who in fact should be heard when we make our decisions on how to treat them. And I thought that that was something that, and please let me know when my time is up.
Just 15 minutes.
Oh, good. Just as I planned. Okay. So this is something for me that seems to be materialized in these cases in Brazil, where animals can in fact go to court and demand their rights. And of course, we had, I think, a lawyer who like pressed the paw of a dog in a petition, but that's symbolical. That's not the point. But I brought here a case for us to analyze, which is a petition by Gisele Sheim, who is part of the same. She's a president of the Animal Rights Association, National Association, that I'm one of the directors of. And so she had this case, which was the first time a first instance Brazilian judge decided in favor of letting a non-human animal act as plaintiff. And this became a final decision because there was an appeal, because what she was asking for was not granted, but nobody appealed to the fact that this animal was a plaintiff in the lawsuit. So that's established now. And this is a first. So tira leite, leite means milk. So tira leite was a free-ranging dog. We have a lot of those in Brazil, who was hurt in a hit and run. And the person who hit him did not give any assistance, although witnesses were yelling at them and say, okay, do something, you hit this dog. And so he had to go for surgery, he had sequelae, and Gisele filed this lawsuit as a lawyer, but of course, Tira Leite is the plaintiff in the lawsuit. So which means that any compensation that's owed to him will be given to him as an individual. We have to think later on how we can maybe think of registering these animals, because if they are going to have bank accounts, what does that mean, like in terms of these animals now? But the first step has been given anyway. So in Brazil, at least, for an entity, and this is, I'm reading to you her arguments, for an entity to act as plaintiff in a lawsuit, it must meet some technical legal requirements. So first, being a subject of rights, having the capacity to be a party, so legal capacity, we could call it, and finally, having procedural capacity. In the absence of this last requirement, procedural capacity, that they are legally represented. So for instance, underage plaintiffs represented by their parents. So if a child wants to demand alimony to their dad, the lawsuit will be filed by the child, represented by her mother, for instance. And it is also possible to be a subject of rights without being a legal person, like unborn children, for instance, or the deceased states and so forth, who hold rights and can pursue those rights by representation, but do not have legal personality. So the deceased estate, for instance, is a collection of maybe goods or duties that that person who died had, and it does not have personality, but can still file lawsuits and be sued as well. And the same goes for the unborn children. I guess this is very common, like you only gain in Brazil, in our civil code, it says that you only gain personality when you're born. And for some time, people understood that that meant that you could not be a subject of rights because you don't have legal personality. But we have had recent precedents saying that, okay, so maybe you don't have legal personality, but you do have a right, for instance, to prenatal care. It's a right that the baby shares with the mother, and you do have a right to be born. So you can be a subject of rights, but even though you're not a person, a legal person. And finally, the capacity of being a party is symmetrical. It's a symmetrical concept to that of being a subject of rights, specifically applied to the process. So this means that the logic is that if you are a subject of rights, if you can take part in legal relations, if you can hold rights or something like that, necessarily you have to have the capacity to be a party in a lawsuit, because you must, if you have a right, you must be able to pursue that right, to materialize that right. And this is due to Article number 5, Title 35 of our federal constitution that secures access to justice to all. This is the article here on the top. The law shall not exclude harm or threat to rights from the judiciary's assessment, and it does not mention if it's human or animal. Secondly, we have Article 225, paragraph 1st, item 7, also in our constitution, that recognizes animal sentience. So let's look at it for a bit here. It's the second one. So we're talking about state, what state has to do and is to protect the fauna and flora. So, okay, we're talking about fauna as a whole, being forbidden according to the law to in any way jeopardize their ecological function, cause the extinction of species, or subject animals to cruelty. So we advocate for the autonomy of this norm. Subjecting animals to cruelty, it has nothing to do with the ecological function of that animal. It could be just a pigeon that in fact has no, it doesn't matter for ecological functions, or it's not on a bridge of extinction, but it has a subject, it is a subject that cannot be a victim of cruelty. And this also means that we are accepting here sanctions, because if you are forbidding that an animal is subjected to cruelty, of course, it means that this animal can feel those acts of cruelty. And this has been accepted in precedents by the Supreme Court. So for instance, there are many examples, but the direct action of unconstitutionality number 4,983 of vaquejada, which is a sort of a rodeo, very traditional in Brazil, where Barroso, one of the justices, talked long about animal rights, quoting the main theories regarding the theme, and concluded that animals were indeed sentient and that our constitution was elaborated with that in mind. And Justice Rosa Weber stated that animals have dignity, a dignity of their own that ought to be respected. We have a federal environmental law also that prohibits acts of cruelty against animals. So here it makes it a crime for you to harm, so abuse, mistreatment, injuring, or mutilating wild, domestic, or domesticated animals, native or exotic. So you have a detention from 3 months to 1 year and a fine. But if it's a dog or a cat, like the case of Tiraleite, the penalty for the conduct described in the caput of the article will be imprisonment from 2 to 5 years, fine, and prohibition of custody. And this penalty is increased if the animal dies. Gisele also cited the Universal Declaration of Animal Welfare and the Cambridge Declaration on Animal Consciousness that could be read, in the very least, as soft international laws in Brazil. Regarding the first one, it even mentions in Article 14 that the rights of animals, like human rights, should enjoy the protection of law, and both have been cited in different precedents in Brazil. Then we have Decree 24,645 of 34, Article 2, paragraph 3rd. And here it says that animals are to be assisted in court by representatives of the public ministry, their legal substitutes, and by members of animal protection societies. So here we have a clear authorization for them to act as plaintiffs. And well, state of Minas Gerais, where Gisele lives and where the lawsuit was filed, has a law that states that, it's recent, of course, animals are recognized as sentient beings, non-person subjects of rights, be entitled to judicial protection in the event that their rights are violated. And of course, we have other precedents that recognize non-human animals as plaintiffs. So we have Sansão, a dog who had both of his hind legs amputated and was declared a subject of rights by Judge Leonardo Moreira with unrestricted dignity, he said, that should be granted full access to justice and to demand that his fundamental rights were respected. We had a trial court in the state of Paraná that recognized animals as subject of rights and decided that they had indeed the capacity to act as plaintiffs in lawsuits. So the judge, Marcel Guimarães Macedo, said, animals as subjects of subjective rights are endowed with the ability to be parties in court, judicial personality, whose legitimacy derives not only from natural law, which is something we argue a lot in Brazil when we are debating animal rights, but also from positive state law. And we had also a first instance judge that recognized that Thor, a dog, could act as co-plaintiff with his tutor, and a similar decision with Rambo and Spike, also given by a trial court. And in the decision, it was said that because of their nature as sentient animals, they held the capacity of being parties, having judiciary personality, and they based it on the articles that I mentioned here. So in my interpretation of what happened here, and here you can see my dogs, we have here Jorge, Tete, and Maya is my mother's dog, and Paçoca is my brother's dog. So I think what happened here is that we have a transition from that view of animals as part of the environment, as part of fauna, that can either mean lovely scenes of nature with animals there, beautiful animals, but it can also mean what we have, boar hunting is something that's legal in Brazil because these animals are considered to be unbalancing the environment, so they can be hunted. So, and we have like over, I guess, 200,000 people who have got the authorization to do that hunting. So the same scenario of the animals part of fauna can mean something very nice, but it can also mean an animal being killed. And the problem, I think, with places where animals are protected only to that degree that they are part of nature, is that, for instance, you can, they need to be under extinction, or they need to be relevant in a way for fauna, and when they are not, they can be murdered. And the law mentions that they should be hunted without cruelty, but how is that possible? So we have a transition, of course, to animals as subjects there, which is something we're quite familiar with because we all deal with dogs and stuff, and this is, they have names and subjectivity and personalities, and for us, that's very natural. So that's it. I hope I did not, this is just, references. That was it.